Hello, my name is Gary Davis. I am a Autodesk technical specialist with the Media and Entertainment Group. Today we're going to be taking a look in this video at the new Media Sync functionality, which is a connection between Autodesk 3ds Max 2013 and Adobe solutions, including After Effects and Photoshop. Autodesk 3ds Max has an internal term we call smart data, and this is basically an interop with other applications that are out there, including other Autodesk products as well as third-party applications. And if you're not familiar, 3ds Max users are broken into two primary categories. One is entertainment users, and the other is design viz users. And as you can see here, we did a survey of our customer base, and it was over, I believe, 1,500 users that responded to this. And you can see without question, whether they were entertainment users or design viz users, that Adobe products were the top two requested interop applications. And you can see by these stars that we did, in fact, in the 2013 release, include lots of other new interop revisions. But focusing specifically on this Adobe workflow, you can see that Design Viz customers requested Photoshop, and that's primarily because Design Viz users are generally rendering still images more frequently than animations, whereas our entertainment customers are more often doing animations than stills. But you can see here After Effects and Photoshop being the #1 and #2 requested applications. We really wanted to listen to that, and that's where the Media Sync interop came from. So Media Sync is just that. It's an After Effects and Photoshop workflow with 3ds Max. And there's a lot of different workflows that I'm going to be showing you in this video. The first one that we're going to be taking a look at is a feature called Viewport Canvas Paint System. And this is a non-destructive layer-based paint system that is compatible with Photoshop. Now, to be clear, Viewport Canvas is not new to the 2013 release and technically not part of Media Sync, but I'm including it into this video because it's quite a powerful feature and it interops with Adobe Photoshop quite well. Then what we're going to be doing is moving on to actually seeing the new render pass system inside of 3ds Max, and that's a way that you can render out multiple passes as layers to both After Effects and Photoshop. And these layers are going to preserve things like layer order, blending modes or transfer modes, depending on your vernacular there, opacity, and as well as layer properties. Then we're going to be taking a look at moving into After Effects specifically for doing things in 3D space, including exchanging things like lights, cameras, nulls, which are 3ds Max point helper objects, and solids, which are called plane primitives inside of 3ds Max. And one thing I really want to drive home is that this workflow between 3ds Max and After Effects is bidirectional, and you'll be seeing that in a moment. But this is something that at this time is a unique workflow where we have both 3ds Max 2013 and After Effects talking bidirectionally to one another. So that's an exciting new feature. And with that, I'll get moving inside of 3ds Max 2013. So this is a typical game asset scene that we've got with a character inside of a 3D environment, and this character is actually using a Photoshop document as its primary texture map. Now, before I get started with the Viewport Canvas, I wanted to reiterate a point I said earlier. Viewport Canvas is not a new feature to 3ds Max 2013. In fact, it was introduced in Max 2011. If I jump over into a web browser here, I just wanted to point out a few resources that are available to find out more about the overall workflow of Viewport Canvas. There's an Autodesk YouTube channel that has a lot of great information, as well as a specific video called Viewport Canvas Toolset 3ds Max 2011 New Features. And this is a very short 6-minute video by my colleague Chris Murray. There's also a specific learning channel at YouTube, unlike this one I showed you just a second ago. This is Autodesk, the entire company. This is a learning channel specifically around 3ds Max. And the last resource I'll talk about is the Area website. And this is another colleague of mine, Louis Marcoux, has a blog that has some specific tips and tricks to Viewport Canvas. And you can see here there's a lot of great videos in here. And just to mention and plug my own blog, under the blogs, there's a category of general. My blog includes more than just 3ds Max. So I have mine under general. It's called Amalgamation. If you go to that, you can see here there's a little old me, and I've got lots of different things about 3ds Max and our creative finishing solutions, and I'm kind of into rendering and that kind of thing. But back to the action of Viewport Canvas inside of 3ds Max. Now, 3ds Max has had the ability to work with Photoshop documents for a number of years, and if you see here, I can load up a PSD document, and this is just a a texture map. One thing I can do actually, if I go to Setup, however, here you can see the traditional workflow of bringing in a Photoshop file is that I can choose an individual layer or collapsed layers. And this, while collapsed is a Photoshop term, this is really just saying treat all the layers in the Photoshop document in their current state as they were saved in the PSD as the texture map that we're using here. And that's okay. That's what we want to do here. And you can see I could view this image. And this is an unwrapped UV coordinate system of all of our UVs. And you can see that this is laid out very cleanly, nice UV space. So this is our two-dimensional texture map. And obviously we're wrapping it onto our three-dimensional character right here. So like I said, in the past, we had the ability to work with Photoshop documents and working with the layers, but you didn't have access to those individual layers. Well, that's where Viewport Canvas comes in. So with a model selected, I can just come under Tools, go to Viewport Canvas, and then here's our Viewport Canvas interface with all of its controls and things for doing layer-based painting directly inside the 3ds Max viewport. Now, since I like to work with this tool quite a bit, I'm just going to dock it over here to the left side of my screen, and I'm going to right click and just say Open All to expand all of these rollouts that you can see here. Now, again, what we've got is our character, and in this particular character, you can see that there's a lot of different maps used in here. So there's a diffuse map, there's a lot of different potential maps, I should say, and there's only a diffuse texture map used, which is that Photoshop document. So what we're going to do is go in here, and you can see that by loading in this texture map that I can directly work with a layer-based system very much like you would in Photoshop. So here's our layers, and you can see that I even have layers already existing in here. There's one called red, which is turned off. If I turn that on and off, you can see that directly in the viewport, and I can manipulate around and work in full 3D space, and at any time I can get back to that full layer-based system. Now, because this is a layer-based system, you can see here that I can just simply add a new layer, and I can do very obvious things right here, like I'll just pick a color, and maybe I can go in and pick a brush here. I'm just going to pick a star brush and maybe use a star mask. Just to mention, you can use any one of your own files here. I can browse custom maps directory, and these are just TIFF files on the hard drive, so I can put any image in here. I'm going to use the star to be very obvious about some things here. Using Control-Shift, I can adjust the brush size, which is just really changing the radius right here, but it's nice to do that interactively in the viewport. And then once again, I'm using a new layer, and I can just go ahead and start painting directly on the surface of our character. And again, you can turn things on and off. You have very traditional things like Photoshop, such as the opacity of your layer. You also have blending modes or transfer modes, and I can just kind of roll my mouse through these to actually see these changing in context directly on my character. So I could just put this back to normal. And I also have things like the ability to do blurring, sharpening, or in general, image filters. So if I just do this blur, for example, you can see that I could just interactively blur that layer. And once again, I'm using this star to be really obvious about these effects, but you would probably want something a little bit more Minotaur-like than this big golden star across his chest. But you can see here I've got blur controls, and I can hit OK on that. And I also have image adjustment controls, things like brightness, contrast, hue, saturation. So I can adjust and do image color corrections on each of these layers. And again, do things like levels where I can control the midtones or the gamma correction of these. So lots of great controls directly in the viewport. And then what happens is when I right click on this model, what happens is that image is saved back to disk as a PSD. Now you'll remember if I immediately load that back in here, I have a red layer. And let's even just reorder these just like I would in Photoshop. And if I right click that and save that out, what I can do is then jump over into Photoshop and see that. Now here's the image, and I already had it open in Photoshop. And to get this bidirectional workflow, all you'd have to do is just say, I want to open up the same image and hit update. And you can see here we've got that red stripe layer right over here. And I can still turn that on and off. And I have this other layer that is the blurred stars that we have in there. So let's say, for example, I was acting as the texture artist. I could be on a different computer. I could be in a different building. Even I could be halfway around the world. I could say, let's add a new layer, and I'm going to call this demo to be very clear about what that layer is. And then maybe just to be really blatant again about this, I'll just come in and say, let's paint. Let's use a paintbrush on this and say, let's circle our character's eye. and put a big red X on his loincloth. And maybe we'd put a question mark right here. And maybe I'm acting like the art director and I say, you know, what is this? I don't know what that is, and so on. So again, non-destructively working. I'm not going to screw anything up, and that's the great feature here about Photoshop layers. Now, once I save this file out, all I need to do is jump back into 3ds Max and just refresh the viewport. So all I have to do is refresh the viewport, and you see that we've got our big red X on the loincloth, and we've got all of our image and additions that we did. Now, once I go in and start editing that, once again, you can see our new file called demo. I could turn off those comments that I don't like from our art director. Maybe those were just markup comments, and we could get back to our texture like this. So again, you can see that there's a whole host of tools, and I won't have time to go through all these in this particular video. But the highlight feature that I want to point out is this interop and the back and forth round tripping between 3ds Max's Viewport Canvas and Adobe Photoshop. In this next example, we have a simple scene from a casual game that was made by one of our customers, and we'd like to give them some credit and thanks. This is the Band Together game by Backflip Studios, and they were kind enough to loan us some assets. They created Band Together using Autodesk 3ds Max as their primary 3D tool, and we'd like to thank Backflip Studios for their use of their assets. So here you can see we've got a simple game level, and we've got a camera. If I just zoom down in a little bit here and get kind of a director's view of what's going on here, and I scrub the timeline, you can see that in this left viewport we have a camera that is in fact kind of panning across our characters, and you can see that on the right side of my interface I've got two views. One is a shaded view and one is a wireframe view for this demonstration. So as I scroll back and forth here, you can see that our characters are kind of coming along here, and we've got our guy on the left, and he has a little match in his hand right here, and he lights it. Candle flame kind of, or the match flame kind of sparks up, and he goes over to light his buddy's candle on the top of his head. Now, this is an animation, and this media sync interop that I'm about to show is the first look at the connection with Adobe After Effects. And this is using animation, although I will be only working for time's sake on one frame. So I'm just going to go to park my playhead on frame 200 here. And again, you can just kind of see we're in our 3D environment. We're just getting a nice look directly at our characters through this pink camera right here. And this is going to be the view that we look at. Now, what I'm first going to do is introduce you to a problem, and then I'm going to show you the solution that we can do, and then bring those assets into After Effects. If I bring up our render dialog right here, under the render dialog, it's set up for a standard output resolution and, you know, to just write some Targa files to disk. We also have a feature in 3ds Max for a number of years called Render Elements. And for time's sake, I'm not going to demonstrate Render Elements. This is basically a way to get all these different render passes or layers out of your 3D render using any number of native or third-party rendering engines. And you can see here there's a lot of things specific to Mental Ray. This is the Mental Ray Arch and Design shader that's very popular inside of 3ds Max. We also have very common things like Z-Depth, self-illumination channels, paint, object ID, and the ever popular matte or alpha channel. Now, I've already set these up ahead of time, and you can see that we don't have quite that many, but there's quite a few in here. And one of the problems that I'm going to show you is just if I go ahead and render this out, I'm going to overwrite some existing frames that I did ahead of time to practice this demonstration. This is going to render out using the scanline renderer, which is one of 4 included renderers inside of 3ds Max. And then you can see that in addition to our primary output, which looks like this with our characters and our wonderful candle flame and all that good stuff, we also output 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different render passes or render elements. Here you can see we have one called specularity, and I can look at the alpha channel of this, or I can just see this as the RGB. And this is just the specular highlights of our character's eyes, so I'll dismiss that. This is one that's called a Z-depth or Z-depth pass, and this is a very common trick to do things like depth of field effects. Now, I'm going to come back to this one in a second. You might see already what the problem is right there. This is a self-illumination pass, and this is our candle flame as well as our character's eyeballs. And this might be a layer that in compositing you wanted to do some glow effects to, something that, you know, anything self-illuminated inside of the 3ds Max material editor would maybe you'd want to do as a post-process glow effect. So that might be a nice thing to consider. I'll put that one over here. This one here is a special render pass called an object ID, and these objects like the matchstick and the candle flame were set up ahead of time, and you can use these in applications such as Adobe After Effects to do other selective post-processing functions. And this is the matte for the characters' bodies, or you might consider this an alpha channel for our characters' bodies. So if we wanted to do something like a selective color correction on just these characters, this would be very useful inside of After Effects for doing that type of work. Now, oops, I got one more I forgot about. This is just the diffuse pass, so there's no shadows in this. There's no self-illumination. It's just the diffuse coloring of our texture maps. So that would be just sort of a raw, lightless version of our scene. But if we look at this, and I dismiss the render dialog, and let's move these out of the way here. If you look at our Z-depth pass here, and we look on our frame here, I've got two viewports intentionally selected or created right here. The bottom one is obviously a shaded view, and the top one is showing the problem that we have, or the trick that we use to create this. Now if you see, if I move this plane object around, the object is called fire. This is a primitive 2D object inside of 3ds Max, and it's using a very old school trick where we just texture map a bitmap onto a card and use its alpha channel. The problem with that trick is that in a Z-depth pass you actually see the geometry of the card. So this is going to be something that a compositor would not like. If I were going to do a depth of field effect on this image right here, using this image as a basis of my blur for maybe like a compound blur or something like that, I'm going to blur a lot of this background where I would unnecessarily have blurred pixels, and I would only want to potentially blur the candle flame or things behind the candle flame and not just this big card. So that's going to be the problem that we're first going to fix, is that candle flame. Another thing to notice about the candle flame, in addition to just the issue with the Z-depth pass, is that in our self-illumination pass, what if we wanted to glow the candle flame differently than our eyeballs? In this self-illumination pass, which we output using render elements, they're kind of combined, so it might be a little bit difficult to sort of do a glow effect on just the candle flame at a different amount than the eyeballs. So you can see that this candle flame is starting to be a little bit problematic or a little bit tricky as far as compositing. So now what I'm going to do is introduce you to a feature called state sets, and state sets gives us the ability to do render pass management out of 3ds Max 2013, and then you'll see how that ties in with the media sync workflow and Adobe After Effects. Now the way that state sets work is they basically record changes to what I like to call the base state. So this dialog right here, you could almost think of different versions of your Max scene. And this is what in the current state is what I would consider the base state. So what I'm going to do is set up multiple states to output different render passes, and ultimately these are going to end up in Adobe After Effects in this case, and you'll see in a moment how this also works. This functionality of state sets and render pass management works as well with Adobe Photoshop for static images. So this first state I'm going to do, I'm just going to rename this main, and this will be our base state. And then to create the actual state, what I'm going to do is just tap this record button. And when this record button is enabled, changes to my Max scene are quite literally being recorded. Now in this particular case, all I'm going to do is come over to the display and say hide the selected, which is our fire card right there. And you'll notice if you keep your eye right here, as I hit hide selected, our candle flame gets hidden. And in this particular case, that's all I want to do is turn off the candle, or I should say hide the candle. Now if I stop recording, you can see here this green arrow. This indicates that my state called main is in fact active. If I turn that off, our candle flame comes back, and you can see it right there. And I'll go ahead and toggle that. Keep your eye right here on the candle flame or up here on the green card. As I toggle that state on and off, you can see all we're doing is hiding and unhiding that candle flame. So that one's a very simple starting point as a primary basis for outputting these render passes. The next state, I'll just say I want to create another state. This one right here is just going to be the fire itself. So it's going to be very similar to the initial state, but almost an exact opposite, where everything else is hidden except the fire. So to create that, I'm just going to say let's record the state, and now I'm going to select the fire, and I'm going to come over under edit and say select invert. So I have everything else in my scene selected. Now as opposed to hiding these objects, what I'm going to do is get a little bit tricky and bring up the material editor. And I've already got a material in here called the matte shadow material type. And this allows me to do things like render objects where they're invisible to the camera, but they will be visible to things like z-depth or receiving shadows, and optionally have things like affecting the alpha and so on. You can see some options right here. So once again, to reiterate, I have everything in my scene selected right now except the candle, and I'm going to go ahead and apply this material to it. So I have everything in my scene except the candle flame, and you can see that down here with this matte shadow. Now another thing that I can do here that's kind of interesting, let me dismiss the material editor, I can actually, while recording these state sets, even do a test render if I want. And that's not really going to be recorded. I'm just doing a test render to make sure that I only have the candle flame, and you can see that indeed we do have the candle flame. But I just noticed here that I accidentally have my render elements still on. Now I don't need render elements for just this candle flame, but that does point out at a very interesting ability of these state sets, is that if I bring up the render dialog and come under render elements, while I'm recording this fire state, I could disable all of the render elements, or I could selectively turn on and off specific render elements. So this is a way that is new to 3ds Max 2013, that we can output multiple render passes as render elements. And that gets very complicated, or potentially complicated, but it also allows the user an incredible amount of power to really give the compositor or the Photoshop artist the ability to really do selective work. So having said that, I'm going to get back to the action here. I have my render elements disabled. I'm double checking that I have this viewport active, and I'm going to go ahead and stop recording on this dialog. Now once again, I'll just do a test render just to see that we've got our candle flame, and that is the candle flame, and that's it. And I can look at the alpha channel, and it's nice and perfect for compositing, and we're good to go there. So I can turn off this second state called fire, and we return back to our base state where everything is unhidden, everything is back to normal with materials, and so on. Now for this last state, what I'm going to do is get a little bit tricky and just show you some other features that we can do. And in this one, I'm going to call it QSAO. And what that stands for is Quicksilver Ambient Occlusion. Now, if you're not familiar with 3ds Max or a real in-depth compositor on the 3D side, Quicksilver is an actual rendering engine inside of 3ds Max. We've been using the scanline renderer for this scene, but what I want to do right now is show you that state sets, this whole system here for render pass management, allows you to output not only different states as render elements or layers, but it also allows you to switch renderers, which is an incredibly powerful feature. So what I'm going to do is say I want to record this state, and what I'm going to do is use the Quicksilver renderer to output a render pass called ambient occlusion that's very useful in compositing. So you'll see by demonstration here, when I'm recording, I'm going to say, let's come through all the way down to assigning our renderer. I'm going to switch this to the Quicksilver hardware renderer. And in this case, I'm going to select everything in my scene. I'm going to apply this special material that I have, which is really just a standard white material at 100% self-illuminated. So everything in my scene is going to get that. I'm going to hide the card like I did before because I don't need the candle flame selected, or visible, I should say. I'm also going to turn off my render elements, and then under the renderer, what I'm going to do is just make it render ambient occlusion. So like I said, I'm getting a little bit tricky here, but I kind of wanted to show you some of the power of state sets. So now what I can do, I've got that all set up. I'm going to go ahead while I'm recording, just do a test render here. So this is actually switching renderers and doing a hardware render, by the way. Quicksilver is a GPU accelerated hardware renderer. So this is going to take advantage of the same hardware that After Effects is using with the Mercury playback engine. So we get a really fast, that took all of 15 seconds to compile the shaders on my video card, as well as render that image out. So this image is going to be useful in compositing, and you're going to ultimately, and I'll steal my own thunder here, we're going to take this image and apply a multiply transfer mode in After Effects to put this over top of our beauty pass. So that looks good. I like the way that that turned out. I can come through here and turn off the recording. Once again, I will exit my last state here, and I return back to our primary state. So now we've set up all of our render passes, and we're good to go out to After Effects. Now to get all these render passes out using our state sets dialog, what we can simply do is create this render output path. So if I come up here to say render, oops, and let me do that again, render outputs, what we're going to get is a render output path that by default goes to our 3ds Max project directory structure. So here you can see, and let me just do a quick Windows zoom in on this. We have a directory structure going to our render output. And then what StateSets did was actually defaulted to using this naming token convention right here, where we have a directory that is the name of each state, and then inside of that directory is the state name underscore output, and in this case it's defaulting to Targa files. Now you can output OpenEXRs or PNGs or any other file format that you're comfortable with. I'm just going to use the default here. But back to the point of this naming convention, this is very useful for people using any compositor, and After Effects people especially like a directory per rendered sequence of numerically numbered image sequences, in this case Targa files. So we've got that set up, and if I just go ahead and tap this set path button, what that does is it sets the output path and the naming token conventions for every single one of these states. Now all I very simply have to do is just right click and say render all these states, and it's going to go through, and in the case of the first state it's going to switch renderers to Quicksilver. It's doing our hardware GPU accelerated ambient occlusion pass there very quickly. It's compiling those shaders. It's about half done right now, and once it finishes up with that one, it's saving that targeted disk. Now it's switched renderers back to the scanline renderer, and it's only going to do our candle flame, which happens really fast. Then it's going to stay in the scanline renderer and do our last primary pass, which is our beauty pass or main render element or render pass, and it's going to pop up all those render passes. So you can see that happened very quickly using two different renderers, and we also have our all of our render elements, and you can see here our Z-depth pass doesn't have that problem with the card anymore. Our self-illumination pass doesn't have the candle flame in it, so we could just glow our character's eyes, and we're really good and all set up to go out to After Effects. So that was the first step in actually rendering out the image sequence, and that could be done on one computer, or you can use up to 9,999 computers with 3ds Max. Every single seat of 3ds Max includes free distributed network rendering using Backburner on up to 9,999 computers per license. So we've got a lot of rendering horsepower potentially available to you, and we've just rendered one frame for this demonstration, but this would obviously work for animations as well. Now to go out to After Effects, what I'm going to do is say come up here under the composite view and open up the composite view for render elements. And I'll remind you that render elements was the output option that we had to separate out all those different render passes. So if I come up here and say, and let's just close this down, if I say compositor, open up the render element view, it's going to go ahead and look out on the hard drive for all those different directories and all those different frames that we rendered. And if I just go ahead and go full screen here and kind of zoom in, I'm just going to use my mouse wheel to do that, and the middle mouse button to kind of pan around here. You can see that I have on the left, I have 1, 2, 3 different outputs, and those are our 3 states right here: Quicksilver, Fire, and Main. Quicksilver, Fire, and Main. And notice that our main has all of those different outputs for render elements, including things like our matte pass, our self-illumination pass, there's our Z-depth, and so on. Now all of that is coming together into this node right here, which is in fact a pre-comp, if you will, and it allows the 3ds Max artist to kind of see visually what our comp is going to look like. And I'll remind you that this top layer that we had, our Quicksilver ambient occlusion, that sort of white look, what that needs to have is a multiply transfer mode. So I can expand each of these layers, and in this case I can just change that transfer mode prior to going into After Effects or Photoshop to multiply. And I could also do things, for example, say that our self-illumination channel was going to be, and let me just trace this up here, our self-illumination channel might be, oh, I don't know, screen. And maybe we drop the opacity of that just to 75%. And basically all I'm doing is showing you that the PreComp workflow allows me to set this up so that I can just quite literally set this up for the After Effects artists and save them time. Now I can, as a last step, I can say let's create the compositor link. And down here, if I zoom in our viewport, you can see that the compositor link has some options for outputting things like cameras, lights, solids, which in 3ds Max would be a primitive plane object, nulls, and footage. Now, nulls are disabled in this particular example, and the reason I'm doing that is because I don't need to output a null helper for every single object in my scene. Now, I'm just going to call this bandy as our output, and what I'm doing is creating what's called a sidecar file, and this is an SOF. And just to be a little bit geeky here for a second, this SOF file is actually an XML flavored file. So you could actually open this up, and if you're a technical director or something, you could actually parse this data. And it's just a file on disk. Let me just show you that out there. If I go out to disk and say, here's our roadshow, render output, here's our bandy SOF, and this is in fact just an XML file that you could open up in a text editor and take advantage of manually editing that. The good news is you don't have to be a programmer to use all this good stuff. What I can do is I've said, let's output this. I created the file. Now what I can do is jump over into Adobe After Effects. Now what I've got set up here, and let me just close our magnifier here. What I've got set up ahead of time is I installed a plugin that comes with Autodesk 3ds Max 2013. And here you can see we have the ability to open composite link from Autodesk. Now before I do that, I'd just like to point out that this plugin works with Adobe After Effects CS4 and later. So I'm currently using CS6, but it will work with 4, 5, 5.5, and 6. So once again, I'm going to just say open up our compositor link. Here's a dialog very similar to what we saw in 3ds Max, and I could optionally import selectively. In this case, I'm just going to, as an After Effects artist, I might not know what the 3D artist did, and I'll just say, go ahead and bring in everything that the 3D artist output. So I'll just say, create the link. I'm going to create a link to that SOF file that was created by 3ds Max, and now you can see that a bunch of stuff came in, and if I double-click Autodesk Link, you're going to see that our file is in fact composited, and you'll notice down here all the layers or all the entities that are in After Effects have this Autodesk link, and you can see that right here. So everything that was brought in using this media sync interop is actually identified so that the After Effects artist knows what's coming from 3ds Max. And if I were to add other things such as Photoshop documents or green screen footage or things like that to this After Effects comp, it would not have the Autodesk link. So that's a nice way that you can tell what's coming from where. Now if I scroll over here, you can see I've got my Quicksilver ambient occlusion that is in fact multiply transfer mode. We set that up in Max, you'll remember. I also set up a screen transfer mode on our self-illumination pass, and you'll also notice that we brought over some optional lights that came over from 3ds Max. So lots of different things are coming over, and that's a real quick first look at the media sync between 3ds Max 2013 and Adobe After Effects. In a moment, I'll be showing you some additional workflows with Photoshop, and then lastly, I'll be rounding it out with another look at a different project from the Bandy game that shows the interactive and real-time update in a bidirectional workflow between the two applications. In this next example, I want to show a similar workflow, and this is just going to Adobe Photoshop with the media sync. So you can see here, if I scrub the timeline, this is not an animation. This is a single file that we're going to be rendering out as an asset for creation of a poster in Photoshop. So this scene was already set up with render elements, and you can see we've got our render elements already set up. And in fact, ahead of time, we already did our state sets and rendered those out. So you can see that we've got multiple states here with our different passes, and ultimately that came together as a comp. And you can see once again, if I zoom in on this, we've set up lots of different transfer modes and layer opacities and things like that. So all of that is going to be red, and if we just simply say, instead of creating a composite link for After Effects, we have the option to output this as a Photoshop file. Now if I jump over into Photoshop, what that file looks like is it comes in, and you can see here all the layers are in fact intact. We also have some channels that we put out, and if I just drag and drop this over here, you can see both our layers and our channels. And if I were to just sort of solo one of these, you could see that this channel right here is just an alpha channel or a mask for some of our characters' cloth. This is one for our character's hair, and so on. So as we get back and get back to our full character, you can see that we have all these different great render elements as layers in Photoshop. And what this gives us the ability to do, let's say, for example, I took this layer right here, which is our main beauty pass, but I control click on this mask of our character's cloth. So I've done a selective a pixel selection across our character. And let's say, for example, I did maybe a hue and saturation. So to just really show this as an extreme example, I'm going to change this saturation all the way up, or pretty close. And now if I just ramp through this hue, you can see that I can very easily and selectively change this. Now, I'm doing this as a very extreme example for the capture of this video, but you can see that we have very nice control over our selective effects. So what I could do is maybe just leave that alone here. And then if I went through and said, let's select all of these and create a folder, and this is going to be a group that I could put all of our layers into. So now we've got all of that information contained in one entity. And if I look over here, I have a second document opened up, and this is just a poster that we've got some layers already set up for. And if I just go ahead and tile this, let's go tile this vertically. You can see we have a nice side-by-side. And then what I could do very easily is have this document and this group of layers from our character and just drag and drop that over into our document. So you can see here our group came over, including our shadows that we rendered out, and maybe we want this behind our text and behind the vignette and all that business, so we can put it back there. And you can see that obviously we still have control over this in a non-destructive manner. Let's go ahead and close this document out. So here we are with our render passes from 3ds Max, and they're all grouped together very nicely, and I can still get back and do selective color corrections. And in fact, instead of all this green cloth, maybe we want to give this an orange look to sort of match that hazy sunset that we've got going. And once again, working in a non-destructive manner, I can just dial things up and down. And again, I'm doing this at very extreme, but you can see that we have total control over all of these different channels and things for doing global color correction, selective color correction, and so on. So that's a very quick look at the way that the media sync can work. In addition to After Effects, it can work for people doing static imagery with Adobe Photoshop. In this example of an iterate rendering, I've actually made it intentionally too bright. And obviously, if you're doing a lot of rendering, you do a lot of tests and revisions and kind of change things and do another render. Well, with iterate now, you have a couple of nice options with the GPU. One of them is that I can control in the hardware resources rollout for iterate how many CPUs or GPUs that I want the actual iterate renderer to use. So if I close this down, I can say when I'm doing an actual production renderer with iterate, I want all the resources in this box workstation to actually take advantage of the NVIDIA Tesla card as well as the Quadro 6000. And what I can also do, actually just to point it out, is enable motion blur, which is a new feature in iterate. But maybe more importantly for all our test rendering is that I can switch over to active shade here, and I just want to check and see that this is a smaller view. And I'm going to say that the active shade is only using half the cores in this box workstation and only one of the video GPU cards. So now when I do an active shade render, what's happening is we see that our image is doing that interactive iterate rendering. However, half of the horsepower of this workstation is still assigned to me. So I can manipulate my scene around and actually navigate around very freely using 6 of the 12 cores, as well as the Quadro 6000 is now set up for me, and the Tesla card is doing the iterate rendering. So now with that view active, I can do things like adjust the exposure control, and I don't even need to do a render preview here. You can see that I can adjust the exposure control, and iterate is doing that update right there in the viewport. And I might say, let's kind of split the difference there and bring that back down. The Tesla card is taking care of all that interactive rendering for me, so there's a nice exposure. And let's maybe throttle that vignette effect back a little bit. And maybe do some mid-tone color correction here to kind of pop that up. Oh, I don't like that. Let's go back down. But you can see the advantage of working in a real-time rendering environment, and that iterate and active shade is a really nice way to work. And then once I'm happy with that result, I can dismiss our active shade viewport and then switch back to our production renderer. Once again, we're back to using all the resources of this workstation. And now when I go ahead and do a full render, you're going to see all of the CPUs and the GPUs in this machine kick in, and I've got this set up to do a 12-second render using, all these cores and GPUs, and you can see that, it knocks this thing out, and I get a really good representation. We've got soft shadows and all that kind of good stuff. Oops, and one more thing I forgot to mention. I'm going to interrupt that render. I'm going to unhide a couple of teapots here. I actually have a teapot just whizzing by right there, and it's going behind a glass tube. And I just wanted to do that last rendering to show you that the motion blur is actually a new feature. So you can see our teapot is actually going to start having samples for the motion blur, and it's actually being blurred behind the glass. So it's not a post-process blur, it's an actually in-camera motion blur that happens as a part of the iRay render. So lots of action going on with the iRay render. It's not just for stills anymore, kids. It's definitely worthwhile to check out for animation of all types. In this last example, I'm going to be going back from 3ds Max into After Effects, and I want to highlight the back and forth or bidirectional interop that we have through MediaSync. In this scene, you can see I have a very simple camera move on a iPad device. And before I get into the action of the MediaSync interop, I just want to point out something about the workflow of how I got this asset. There's a website Google has called the 3D Warehouse, and if you just do a search, you can see that if I did a search for iPad, it comes up with literally hundreds of objects that I can download. And 3ds Max has the ability to work and natively import files in the SketchUp file format. So SketchUp is a 3D application that Google has for doing primitive modeling, and they're non-animated or anything like that. But it's a great tool that a lot of people are using and posting assets to the Google Warehouse. So here, what I did ahead of time was downloaded this asset, and I just drag and dropped it into 3ds Max, and you have not only the asset itself, but I also have materials that came through using the Mental Ray Arch and Design shader. So all of that came across, and all I had to really do was kind of just light and animate the camera in this scene. So again, we've got an animated camera, as you can see in my multiple views, and I also have a couple of different omni lights or omnidirectional lights. I also have these 2 point helpers or null objects, and these would be able to come across over into After Effects. So what I'm going to do is, once again, I'm going to come up under the rendering dialog for state sets. This scene has already been set up ahead of time for doing target output, so I'll just go ahead and set that path, and then right click and very simply say render all states. Now this scene is likewise similar to what we saw earlier using the Quicksilver hardware rendering engine, so it's going to render very quickly on the GPU of this computer. And then once we get that out, what we also have is the ability, once again, to output more than just the rendered frames. So once again, I'm going to say compositor, create link. Compositor, create the link. And I'm going to say, let's reset it. And in this case, I am going to include everything, including footage, cameras, lights, solids, which in this case, just to show you, I have a plane object in 3ds Max, and that could be found under create, geometry, primitives, plane. So anything that you create with this primitive plane object, primitive type, could be output to Adobe After Effects as a solid. So I have this green solid here that I've set up ahead of time. And just to show you the little trick that I did here, under object properties, I've turned it to be non-renderable. So that object won't be visible in my targas, but it will be available as an option in MediaSync. So once again, I can say create link, and in this case it's going to be iPad, and I'm creating that link on the hard drive. Once again, I'll jump over into After Effects and use our open compositor link from Autodesk, create the link to our iPad, and here once again you can see that I could optionally bring in some or all of the assets from 3ds Max. I'll double click on our Autodesk link, and if I just play this down, let me just drop to maybe half res here to just go a little bit quicker. You can see that I not only have the footage in here, but I also have a couple of lights that we brought in. And I also have down here this solid plane. If I drag and drop that up to the top, you can see that I have that solid object directly in my viewport. Now this is where it gets really fun, is that I have a bidirectional link between these two assets, or between these two applications rather. 3ds Max and After Effects are talking to one another through that sidecar file. Now if I expand this solid object and expand its transform, you can see that the way that this happened, the way that this data came across, is that there's a keyframe for every single frame. And even though this object isn't animated, it's actually the camera that's animated, it got a keyframe per frame. So I don't necessarily want that. If I want to just select all the keys in After Effects, I can just select that whole position channel and delete those keys. And just to show you that the object hasn't changed position or anything like that, I just deleted the keyframes. And the reason it's staying there sort of slave to our footage is that the camera is animated and the camera came across from 3ds Max. So here you can see we have our camera animation, and it indeed has all of its transform keys from 3ds Max. But what I want to do is, as the After Effects artist, I might decide at the end of our animation here, we want the solid object, or the entire iPad for that matter, to be over here. And the reason could be just a design issue that we want to have text over here on the right or something like that. But the point is that I can make that change to the actual 3D geometry, and then what I can do is kind of hit the magic button here and say update to the link. And what that did when I clicked that button was wrote back that information and the changes to that SOF sidecar file on disk. Now if I jump back into 3ds Max, the change hasn't happened yet, but you can see right here this button has in fact changed, and it now says update from link. And when I click this button, keep your eye on the green solid right here, I click that button and those changes in fact come across back from After Effects. So that's going to be a way that I could then say, you know, as the 3D artist, I could make those changes to accommodate my render or the request from our After Effects artist. I could optionally, you know, re-render all those states. And once again, I'm just re-rendering using that hardware accelerated renderer. Great option for doing broadcast design and motion graphics. It's a really fast renderer, and there's a lot of great features in Quicksilver. And then once I've rendered those frames out, I can very quickly come over here and just either cache my footage, or I could just say replace the footage with itself. So let's just go out to our D, demos, frames. Here's our iPad, which is a sequence. And now you can see that that update actually changed, and it accommodates our green solid. At this point, you could do all your After Effects tricks, like putting your own footage onto there. And I wouldn't have to necessarily do that inside of 3ds Max, because that's more of a compositing function, and doing things like glows or comping this entire animation over top of something, maybe real world footage that was shot using a camera, and so on. So that's, again, a very quick look at the media sync interop and the bidirectional workflows between 3ds Max 2013 and Adobe After Effects. With that, I'm going to conclude the video. I'd like to thank you for your time. Once again, my name is Gary Davis, and for more information, you can check out the 3ds Max interop and all of our products for that matter at area.autodesk.com. Thanks.